I stepped into the restaurant and felt a cold stone drop in my stomach. The air was thick with the scent of truffle oil and the kind of loud, unearned laughter that only happens when someone else is footing the bill. My family's table was a disaster of half-empty wine glasses and steak juice. My father sat at the head, bearded and beaming, gesturing wildly with a glass of bourbon that cost more than my weekly groceries. I wasn't looking at them, though. I was staring at the long, white receipt sitting in the center of the table like a live grenade. "Oh, Melissa, you're finally here," my mom said, her voice light, like a joke we'd all rehearsed. She didn't ask if I was hungry. She didn't offer me a seat. She just tilted her head and gave me that soft smile she uses when she's about to ask for a favor. "You don't mind covering the bill, right? We figured since you're doing so well lately." My sister laughed, not surprised and not embarrassed. And that's when I realized I wasn't invited to join the feast. I was invited to fund it. My name is Melissa. I'm 26 years old, and for most of my life, my family has described me with one word: easy. Easy to deal with, easy to rely on, easy to ask for favors. They never meant it as a compliment. On paper, we look like the picture of a solid, happy family. A confident father who loves a good joke, a neatly dressed mother, and a table full of siblings and grandchildren laughing over pizza and wine. If you saw us from across the room, you'd think we were close, warm, and normal. But closeness isn't measured by how loud you laugh together. It's measured by who is allowed to take up space, and who is expected to pay for it. Growing up, I learned early that being quiet made life smoother. Being low maintenance earned me a pat on the arm and a good girl. But as I stood there staring at that receipt, I realized that my easiness had become the secret infrastructure for their luxury. Tonight wasn't just another dinner. It was the night I decided to stop cushioning their lives. It was the night the easy daughter became the one they could no longer afford. The memory of that pat on the arm is the foundation of my entire life. It was a specific kind of touch, brief, light, and final. It was the reward for being the child who didn't need anything. While my sister, Sarah, was a hurricane of theater rehearsals and late-night crises, and my brother, Leo, was a constant orbit of expensive sports gear and broken windows, I was the girl who stayed in the lines. I was the silent observer of my own childhood. I remember my 12th birthday clearly. Sarah had just been cast in the school play, and the house was vibrating with her needs, costume fabrics draped over the sofa, her voice echoing through the halls as she practiced lines. My parents were entirely consumed, their calendars marked with her rehearsal dates in bold red ink. When I walked into the kitchen that morning, my mother was on the phone, juggling a schedule while my father helped Leo find his missing cleats. "Happy birthday, honey," my mom whispered, covering the mouthpiece for a split second. She reached out and gave my forearm that familiar, dry pat. "You're such a good girl for being so patient. We'll do something special when things calm down, okay?" But things never calmed down. I learned quickly that special was a currency reserved for the loud. If I didn't complain about the hand-me-down clothes that were 3 sizes too big, I was sensible. If I sat quietly in the back of the car while Leo and Sarah argued over the radio for 3 hours, I was mature. My parents' praise was never about who I was, but about how little I cost them in emotional energy. I became an expert at shrinking. I learned to anticipate their stress and preemptively withdraw my own needs to make room for theirs. I saw how Sarah's tantrums were met with long, late-night talks and how Leo's failures were met with expensive tutors and second chances. My success, however, was treated as an expected baseline. When I made the honor roll, it was a quick nod. When Sarah passed a remedial math class, it was a celebratory dinner. By the time I hit my 20s, the easy label had hardened into a permanent identity. I was the one they called when they needed a ride to the airport at 4 a.m. or a last-minute babysitter for Sarah's kids. They didn't ask if I was busy because, in their minds, the low-maintenance daughter didn't have a life of her own. She was simply the padding that kept their world from feeling the hard edges of reality. I was the invisible girl, and for a long time, I thought that being invisible was the only way to be loved. To my family, my life was a series of beige choices. They saw my small, one-bedroom apartment on the quiet side of town and called it quaint, which was their polite word for insignificant. They saw my 5-year-old hatchback and assumed I was struggling to keep up with the payments. In their eyes, I was still the girl who stayed in the lines, working a safe, low-level administrative job with a predictable, modest salary. I let them believe it. In fact, I cultivated it. The truth was that I had spent my 20s building a career as a senior data analyst for a global logistics firm. I was good at what I did, meticulous, observant, and capable of finding patterns where others saw chaos. But I knew that if my father ever found out I was earning 6 figures, my income would no longer be mine. It would become the family's emergency fund. My sister's business ideas would suddenly require investors, and my brother's mounting credit card debt would become my responsibility as the sister who was doing so well. So, I played the part. When we went out, I wore clothes from 3 seasons ago. I talked about budgeting and how expensive gas had become. I'd listen to my father brag about his latest vintage watch or my sister's new designer handbag, nodding along as if I couldn't even imagine such luxury. I lived a double life, a successful professional by day, and a struggling, reliable daughter by night. It was a survival tactic. By keeping their expectations low, I managed to keep the requests manageable. If they thought I only had $50 to my name, they would only ask for $40. It was a stressful way to live, hiding my promotions, tucking my savings accounts away like secrets, but it was the only way I could protect my future from their insatiable appetite for the easy way out. I thought I was being clever, that I had found a way to stay in their lives without being consumed by them. I didn't realize that even a safe job and a modest car weren't enough to satisfy people who believed they were entitled to every drop of my effort. I was still their safety net. I had just made the net look thinner than it actually was. But as I stood there at the restaurant, looking at that long, white receipt, I realized that to them, it didn't matter how much I actually had. They were going to take it all anyway, simply because I was the one who never said no. That night, after the hum of the restaurant had faded into a dull throb behind my eyes, I sat at my small kitchen table and opened my laptop. I didn't go to a news site or check my work emails. Instead, I navigated to a folder buried 3 layers deep, labeled with a title so boring no one would ever think to click it, Utilities Archive 2019 to 2024. Inside wasn't a collection of power bills for my apartment. It was the digital ledger of my family's survival. As the screen glowed in the dark room, I began to scroll through the PDFs and spreadsheets I had meticulously maintained for years. I called it the infrastructure of entitlement. It started small, a $50 bridge loan for my brother Leo when his phone was cut off 6 years ago. Then, a $300 car repair for my sister Sarah that she forgot to PayPal me back for. But as I scrolled, the numbers grew heavier. There was the time I paid my parents' property taxes because they had miscalculated their vacation budget. There were the monthly subscriptions for streaming services and gym memberships that they all used, but which hit my credit card every 30 days like clockwork. I saw the utility bills for my parents' house from the winter of 2022, a season when the heat stayed on only because I had quietly called the company and settled the balance before the shut-off notice could be mailed. I looked at the notes I had typed in the margins of the spreadsheet. Mom said she'd pay back by Friday. Leo promised to work overtime. Dad said it was just a temporary glitch. None of it was temporary. These weren't loans, they were subsidies. By quietly stepping in to fix every glitch, I hadn't been helping them, I had been enabling a lifestyle they couldn't afford. I had become the invisible foundation of a house that was rotting from the inside out. I was the reason they could order the most expensive steak and the vintage bourbon without a second thought. They weren't worried about the cost because, in their world, the cost didn't exist. It just disappeared into the Melissa folder. The total at the bottom of the sheet was a number that made my stomach turn. It was enough for a down payment on a house, or a decade of the travel I had denied myself to keep them afloat. I realized then that my easiness had a very specific price tag. I wasn't just the quiet daughter, I was the primary shareholder in a company that paid zero dividends. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark. The silence of my apartment felt different now. It wasn't the silence of a safe life anymore. It was the silence of a storm that was finally ready to break. For years, I had been the one keeping the lights on for everyone else. It was time to see what happened when I finally flipped the switch. When I finally closed the laptop, my partner, Marcus, was standing in the doorway, 2 mugs of tea in his hands. He didn't say anything at first, he just set a mug down near my elbow and looked at the glowing screen. He had seen the utilities archive before, but tonight, the expression on my face told him the data had finally transformed into something more volatile than mere numbers. "They didn't even save you a seat, did they?" he asked softly. "Not even a menu," I replied, my voice sounding thin in the quiet kitchen. "Just the bill." It was sitting there like it had my name printed on the total line. Marcus sat across from me, his presence a stark contrast to the chaotic, loud energy of my family. He was the only person who knew the truth about my career, my actual bank balance, and the suffocating weight of the easy daughter persona. He reached out, his hand steady over mine. "Melissa, they don't think you're ever going to stop," he said. It wasn't a judgment, it was an observation of a mathematical fact. To them, you aren't a person with your own goals or a future to save for. You're a utility. You're the water that comes out of the tap. They don't wonder where it comes from or how much it costs, they just expect it to be there when they turn the handle. His words hit me harder than the bill had. I realized then that my family's entitlement wasn't an accident or a temporary lapse in judgment, it was a choreography. We all had our steps. They would overspend, I would feel the anxiety, they would drop a hint, and I would quietly perform the financial rescue. By being the silent partner in their irresponsibility, I had helped write the script that was currently destroying me. "I'm done being the ghost in the machine," I told him, the decision finally crystallizing in my chest. "So, what's the plan?" Marcus asked. "Are you going to tell them?" "No," I said, a cold, sharp clarity settling over me. "If I tell them, they'll just turn it into another drama where I'm the difficult one and they're the victims. They'll argue, they'll guilt trip, and they'll find a way to make me pay just to make the noise stop. I'm not going to give them a performance. I'm just going to stop participating in the dance." I thought about the next family gathering, the make-up dinner my mother was already texting about. For the first time in my life, I wasn't planning my excuses or checking my savings. I was planning my exit. I was going to show up, I was going to be easy one last time, and then I was going to let the music stop while they were still mid-step. I was finally ready to see what happened when the utility they relied on finally ran dry. The text arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, vibrating against my mahogany desk while I was deep in a complex dataset. It was from my mother. "So sorry about the mix-up last week, honey. We felt terrible that you missed the food. Let's do a make-up dinner this Sunday at Delmonico's. Our treat. Love you." I stared at the words "our treat." In the vocabulary of my family, those words were a polite fiction. It was the bait they used to ensure I showed up to the table, knowing that by the time the dessert menus were handed out, a temporary technical difficulty with a credit card or a forgotten wallet would inevitably shift the burden back to me. Usually, a text like this would trigger a low-grade fever of anxiety in my chest. I would spend the rest of the week calculating how much I could afford to lose and how to gently decline the most expensive appetizers without causing a scene. But this time, the anxiety was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, surgical precision. "That sounds lovely, Mom," I typed back. "I'll be there at 7. Can't wait." I hit send and felt a strange, light sensation in my fingertips. My compliance was the anchor they relied on to keep their chaotic ship afloat, and I was giving it to them one last time. I didn't mention that I had already spent the morning on the phone with my bank and my attorney, or that I had spent my lunch break drafting a very specific set of instructions for the restaurant manager. When my mother replied with a string of heart emojis, I knew she was already imagining the vintage champagne she was going to order on my dime. She mistook my quick yes for the same old Melissa, the girl who would rather pay a $1,000 bill than endure 5 minutes of awkward tension. She thought I was coming to the table to play my part in the choreography. Marcus watched me from across the living room that evening as I picked out my outfit for the dinner. I chose a dress I'd had for years, something modest and unremarkable. "You look dangerous," he said, though I was just standing there in a faded navy hemline. "I'm just being easy," I replied, a small, tight smile pulling at my lips. "Isn't that what they want?" I was setting the stage, ensuring every player was in their preferred position. They wanted a celebration of their own excess, and I was going to give them exactly that. I was walking into the trap they had set for my bank account, but for the first time in 26 years, I wasn't the prey. I was the one who had quietly changed the locks on the cage. Sunday was coming, and for the first time, I wasn't worried about the cost. I was looking forward to the silence that would follow. The chandelier at Delmonico's cast a warm, amber glow over the table, but it couldn't mask the predatory efficiency of my family's hunger. I sat at the center, a silent anchor in a sea of escalating extravagance. My father didn't even look at the prices, he simply tapped the vintage wine list and gestured for the sommelier, his bearded face flushed with the kind of confidence that only comes when you're spending someone else's future. "A bottle of the 96, I think," he boomed, his voice carrying to the neighboring tables. "And let's start with the seafood tower. The grand one." "Why not? We're celebrating." Beside him, Sarah was already halfway through a conversation about her upcoming vacation, her fingers tracing the gold leaf edge of her menu. She ordered the Wagyu ribeye without blinking, then turned to the waiter and added a side of lobster tails and truffle risotto for the table. My brother Leo followed suit, laughing as he ordered a second round of top-shelf bourbon before the appetizers had even arrived. Even the children were encouraged to order whatever caught their eye, their carefree giggles underscored by the sound of silver hitting fine china. I watched it all with a strange, detached fascination. It was a choreography I knew by heart, the intentional ignoring of the right-hand column of the menu, the way they made eye contact with me whenever the waiter hovered near, checking for the familiar nod of my easy compliance. They weren't just eating, they were performing a lifestyle they hadn't earned, safe in the knowledge that I was sitting there, a human safety net ready to catch the fall. "You're awfully quiet, Mel," my mother said, leaning over to pat my arm. Her smile was practiced, her eyes already clouded by the expensive Chardonnay. "Not hungry? You should try the oysters. They're imported." "I'm fine, Mom," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "I'm just enjoying the view." I watched as the table filled with plates that cost more than my monthly rent. I watched my father toast to family and prosperity, his glass clinking against Sarah's. They were so blinded by their own greed that they didn't notice the weight of the silence I was keeping. They saw the same Melissa they had always seen, the girl who stayed in the lines, the girl who absorbed the debt so they could keep the dream alive. They didn't notice that I hadn't touched my own wine. They didn't notice that I had quietly placed my phone on the table, the screen dark but ready. They were mid-dance, spinning faster and faster into a debt they assumed I would vanish for them. I felt a flicker of the old anxiety try to rise, but I pushed it down. The choreography was almost over. The music was about to stop, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to be the one to catch them when they tripped. The indulgence reached its peak as the last of the dessert plates, a trio of gold-flaked chocolate torts, were scraped clean. My father leaned back, patting his stomach with a look of immense satisfaction, and signaled the waiter with a casual, sweeping flick of his wrist. I felt Marcus's hand tighten briefly on mine under the table. This was the moment where the music usually stopped and I was expected to provide the floor. The manager, a man I had spoken with for 20 minutes on Friday afternoon, approached the table. He wasn't carrying the usual leather-bound folder. Instead, he held a sleek digital tablet. He leaned in toward my father, his expression a mask of professional neutrality. "The bill for this evening, sir," the manager said, his voice low but perfectly clear. My father didn't even reach for it. He didn't even look up. Oh, just put it on the usual authorization. My daughter's account on file. Melissa, you sorted that out before we sat down, right? The table went quiet, but it was the expectant, comfortable quiet of people waiting for a servant to finish a task. My mother began reapplying her lipstick in a small silver compact, and Sarah started scrolling through her phone, likely checking the flight prices for the vacation she assumed I would eventually subsidize. I'm afraid there is no authorization on file, sir, the manager said. My father's laughter died instantly. He blinked, a look of genuine confusion crossing his face. What? No, that's impossible. We've been coming here for a year. Melissa, tell him. I took a slow sip of my water, letting the glass click softly against the table as I set it down. I called the restaurant this morning, Dad. I canceled the standing authorizations. On everything. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was sharp, jagged, and heavy. My mother's lipstick smeared slightly as she looked up, her eyes wide. Sarah's thumb froze on her screen. I don't understand, my mother whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of embarrassment and growing anger. Melissa, what are you doing? This is Delmonico's. You can't just, we've already eaten. I've requested separate checks, I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. I looked the manager in the eye and nodded. Please. Bring a check for my meal and my partner's. The rest of the table will be settling their own balances. The manager tapped a button on the tablet. Certainly, ma'am. As he walked away to print the receipts, the solid image of my family began to dissolve in real time. My father's face turned a deep, mottled red, his confidence vanishing as he realized he was sitting in a five-star restaurant with a four-figure bill and a wallet that had been empty for years. The easy daughter was gone, and in her place was a woman who was finally letting them feel the weight of their own choices. The silence that followed was louder than any of my father's previous outbursts. It was the sound of a carefully constructed illusion shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. My father's hand, which had been resting so confidently on the table, began to tremble as he reached for his back pocket, pulling out a leather wallet that I knew held more receipts than cash. Across from him, Sarah's face had transformed from a mask of boredom into one of pure, unadulterated panic. Melissa, stop this, my father hissed, his voice low and dangerous, eyes darting toward the neighboring tables to see if anyone was watching. You're making a scene. Just pay the bill, and we'll settle up at home. You know I'm just waiting on that closing. We've been settling up at home for 10 years, Dad, I said, my voice cutting through his desperation like a blade. And the closing never happens. The bridge loans never end. The temporary glitches have become my entire financial life. How can you be so selfish? Sarah snapped, her voice rising in pitch. She looked at the $300 steak she had just finished, then back at me. It's just a dinner. We're family. You're seriously going to let us sit here and be humiliated over a few $100s? It's not just a dinner, Sarah, I replied, leaning forward. It's the seafood tower you didn't need. It's the vintage bourbon Leo ordered because he knew I was paying. It's the property taxes, the utility bills, and the gym memberships I've been quietly funding while you all tell me how easy I am. My mother finally spoke, her eyes welling with well-timed tears. Is this what it comes down to, Melissa? You're putting a price tag on our relationship? After everything we've done for you, you're sending us an invoice for your love? That was the line. The final, familiar hook they used to reel me back into the choreography. But tonight, it didn't catch. I'm not the one who put a price tag on this family, I said, and for the first time, the weight in my chest felt light, almost airy. You did. You've been billing me for your affection since I was 12 years old. You only pat me on the arm when the check is paid. You only call me good when I'm being useful. Love shouldn't come with an invoice, Mom. And it shouldn't be the reward for staying quiet while you bleed me dry. I stood up, the chair scraping softly against the floor. My father was frantically counting bills, Sarah was arguing with the manager about a misunderstanding, and Leo was staring at his feet. They looked small. For the first time in my life, the giants who had loomed over my world looked like people who had simply forgotten how to be responsible for themselves. I looked at the separate check the manager had placed in front of me, laid down the exact amount for my meal, and walked away from the table before the excuses could start again. The weeks that followed were marked by a frantic, buzzing silence. The group chat, once a relentless stream of links to expensive vacation rentals and screenshots of must-have designer items, went cold. There were no more midnight emergency texts about car repairs or utility shut-off notices. When I did hear from them, the tone had shifted from entitled expectation to a sharp, wounded defensiveness. My father sent one final, blistering email accusing me of betraying the family values, but when I didn't reply with an apology or a check, even the anger seemed to run out of breath. Slowly, the fallout settled into a new, humbler reality for them. Without my quiet subsidies, the infrastructure of entitlement collapsed. Sarah had to cancel her luxury trip and move into a smaller apartment. Leo took on a second job at a warehouse to cover his mounting debts. My parents stopped hosting the lavish, wine-soaked dinners that had defined their social standing. They were finally being forced to live within the borders of their own means, and while it was painful for them, it was honest. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one rushing to catch them. I stopped smoothing the edges of their bad decisions and paying over the consequences of their greed. I didn't cut them off entirely, but I became a ghost in their financial lives. If they reached out, I answered with a kindness that was no longer tied to my bank account. If they asked for a loan, I said no without providing a 3-paragraph justification. I realized that by being easy, I hadn't been helping them, I had been keeping them from growing up. At home, the air felt different. One evening, Marcus and I sat in our quiet living room, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator and the rain tapping against the glass. There was no tightening in my chest, no mental tally of how much I owed to keep someone else's world from tilting. I looked at my laptop, still tucked away in the drawer, and realized I hadn't opened the utilities archive in a month. I didn't need to. The data no longer held power over me. I used to think that peace was something you had to buy, that if I just paid enough, I could purchase a moment of family harmony. But true peace wasn't a transaction. It was the steady, quiet realization that my time and my life finally belonged to me. The silence on the other side of that final restaurant bill wasn't loneliness. It was the sound of a woman who had finally stopped shrinking. I wasn't the easy daughter anymore. I was finally, for the first time, free. Please, if you enjoyed this story, do well to subscribe, like, share and comment. Thank you.